In 1941, the sky over Oahu was still soft with dawn when Ensign Daniel Mercer stepped onto the deck, coffee cooling in his hand. Sunday mornings were supposed to be quiet. The harbor lay calm, battleships resting like steel islands, their hulls mirrored perfectly in the water. The Navy had always told him this place was untouchable. Too distant, too well defended, too important to ever be surprised. He believed it. Everyone did. The first explosion shattered that belief in an instant. A thunderclap ripped through the air, so violent it seemed to tear the sky open. Mercer dropped his cup as a column of smoke and fire erupted from a ship across the harbor. For a split second, his mind refused to understand what his eyes were seeing. Training drills didn't look like this. Drills didn't throw men into the water or turn steel into burning wreckage. Then the planes came screaming in. They flew low, impossibly low, red markings flashing beneath their wings as they released torpedoes that skimmed the water like skipping stones. Sirens wailed too late. Anti-aircraft guns barked into the sky, disorganized, frantic. Sailors ran in every direction. Some toward their stations, others toward the rails as ships began to list and sink beneath them. The harbor that had felt so permanent, so safe, became a killing ground in minutes. Mercer watched one of the great battleships take a direct hit. The explosion punched upward, lifting metal and men alike into the air. Flames raced along the deck. He could hear the screams even over the roar of engines and collapsing steel. Oil spread across the water, igniting into sheets of fire that trapped sailors who had leapt overboard, believing the sea would save them. Orders came fast and confused. Ammunition was locked. Power was out. Radios crackled with fragments of messages that made no sense. Someone shouted that this was no drill. Someone else shouted that the carriers were gone, that they weren't in the harbor. That single fact passed from mouth to mouth like a rumor too strange to matter in the moment. All that mattered was survival. Within an hour, the harbor was unrecognizable. Ships that had symbolized American power lay broken and burning. Smoke blotted out the sun. The illusion of security, the belief that distance and steel were enough, was gone. Whatever war the Navy had prepared for, this was not it. As the last planes disappeared into the distance, a terrible silence settled over the water, broken only by fires still burning and men still crying for help. Mercer stood frozen, uniform streaked with soot and oil, staring at the wreckage. He understood something then with a clarity that hurt. The United States had not just been attacked. It had been exposed. For a brief, terrifying moment, the Pacific no longer belonged to them. In the weeks that followed Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Hale found himself staring at charts instead of the ocean. They were immaculate rows of numbers, silhouettes of ships, tonnage totals that suggested overwhelming strength. 15 battleships, 8 carriers, hundreds of cruisers and destroyers. On paper, it looked like a navy that should never have been caught off guard. Yet Hale knew, uncomfortably, that paper strength had little to do with what had just happened. Most of those battleships had been designed for a different age. They were built to fight each other in neat lines, exchanging thunderous broadsides at predictable ranges. They were powerful, yes, but slow, fuel-hungry, and dependent on doctrines written when aircraft were still considered auxiliary weapons. Hale had served aboard one of them. He remembered how long it took to turn, how every maneuver felt deliberate and heavy, as if the ship itself resisted change. The carriers were another matter. They were fast, experimental, and unsettling to many senior officers. Hale had sat through wardroom debates where admirals argued that airplanes were fragile things, too dependent on weather, too easily replaced by armor and guns. Battleships, they insisted, were the backbone of naval power. Carriers were scouts at best, curiosities at worst. Even as pilots trained relentlessly on deck landings and strike coordination, their true role remained undefined, hovering somewhere between promise and doubt. Treaties had shaped everything. Limits imposed after the last war forced compromises. Smaller guns, thinner armor, slower speeds. The fleet looked balanced, but it was constrained, optimized for rules that an enemy was no longer willing to follow. Hale realized now that the Navy hadn't just been bound by steel and rivets, but by assumptions. Assumptions about how wars began, about where enemies could strike, about which weapons truly mattered. As reports from the Pacific arrived, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. The Navy had strength, but not readiness. Experience, but not clarity. It had prepared meticulously for a decisive battle that never came, while a different kind of war had already begun. And somewhere between the numbers on the page and the wreckage in the harbor, Hale understood the truth that would define everything that followed. The Navy had not been weak, but it had been looking in the wrong direction. Dawn broke quietly over the Pacific that morning, far from the smoke and fire of Pearl Harbor. The sea stretched empty to the horizon, steel gray and indifferent, as the aircraft carrier Enterprise cut through the swells. Lieutenant, junior grade, Samuel Reed leaned against the rail, watching the deck crew prepare for the day's recovery operations. Fighters and bombers were expected back soon, returning from routine patrols. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that lulled sailors into thinking the war, if it ever came, would announce itself politely. Then the radio crackled. At first, the message was fragmented, broken by static and disbelief. An attack. Hawaii. Pearl Harbor. Reed felt his stomach tighten as the words repeated. Clearer this time, stripped of any ambiguity. This was no drill.
No accident.
The war they had talked about in abstract terms had arrived without warning, and it had struck while the carrier was safely beyond the harbor's reach. All around him, the mood on deck shifted instantly. The easy rhythms of routine vanished. Orders were snapped instead of spoken. Engines roared louder as the ship increased speed, carving a sharper line through the water. Reed realized, with a strange mix of guilt and relief, that they were alive because they had not been where they were supposed to be. The carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, had been out at sea, spared not by armor or guns, but by coincidence and timing. As reports continued to pour in, the scale of the destruction became clear. Battleships burned. Men were trapped below decks. The harbor was a graveyard of twisted steel. Reed pictured the massive hulls he had seen docked there only days before, symbols of American naval might rendered helpless in minutes. Those ships had been the pride of the fleet, the embodiment of decades of doctrine and belief. And now they were sinking, yet the carriers lived. That fact, whispered first and then spoken aloud, carried a weight that no one fully understood yet. Reed felt it settling over the ship like a pressure change before a storm. The battleships had been the past, immense, powerful, and inflexible. The carriers were something else entirely. They were movement, reach, possibility. In the days that followed, the carriers became the center of everything. Orders arrived directing them to hunt, to probe, to strike where they could. There would be no decisive surface engagement, no grand line of battle clash. Instead, the war would be fought across hundreds of miles of ocean, by pilots who would never see the ships they attacked, and by sailors who would feel the impact of decisions made far beyond the horizon. Reed watched the transformation unfold firsthand. Flight decks that had once supported exercises and demonstrations now became launch pads for war. Planes lifted off in steady streams, engines screaming as they vanished into the sky, carrying bombs and torpedoes toward targets unseen. Each launch was a gamble, each recovery a small miracle. The ocean did not forgive mistakes. At night, the officers talked quietly in the wardroom, voices low, expressions tense. The old assumptions were being stripped away faster than anyone expected. Battleships could not reach an enemy they could not see. Guns were useless against aircraft arriving from beyond visual range. Air power, once dismissed as fragile and unreliable, had proven capable of sinking the strongest ships afloat in a matter of minutes. The carriers had not just survived Pearl Harbor. They had inherited the war. Reed felt the weight of that responsibility every time he watched planes disappear into the distance. These ships were now the Navy's striking arm, its shield, and its hope. Lose them, and there would be nothing left to stop Japan from pushing farther east, toward Australia, toward the American mainland itself. The margin for error was terrifyingly thin. As weeks turned into months, the consequences of that December morning grew clearer. The Navy reorganized around the carriers with urgency bordering on desperation. Resources flowed toward aviation. More pilots, more planes, more training. New tactics were written almost overnight, refined through blood and loss. The fleet learned, painfully and quickly, that control of the sea no longer depended on who carried the biggest guns, but on who could dominate the air above it. Reed flew missions that would have been unthinkable only a year earlier. Strikes launched hundreds of miles from the target. Coordinated attacks involving multiple squadrons, timed to the minute. The complexity was staggering, the margin for failure razor-thin. And yet it worked. When planes returned with reports of enemy ships burning, the meaning of Pearl Harbor shifted again. What had once seemed like an unanswerable blow was now the beginning of something else. A forced evolution. He thought often of the men trapped aboard the sunken battleships, of the traditions that had gone down with them. There was no triumph in their loss, only grim necessity. The war had demanded a sacrifice, and the Navy had paid it in steel and blood. In return, it had been pushed into the future whether it was ready or not. By mid-1942, it was impossible to deny the truth. The carriers were no longer an experiment. They were the decisive weapon. Battleships still sailed, still fired their guns, but they now followed rather than led. The hierarchy of power had inverted, not through theory or debate, but through catastrophe. Reed stood on the flight deck one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. Planes were being secured, crews exhausted but focused. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the enemy was preparing his own moves, unaware of the full transformation taking place. The war was far from won. Losses would come. Ships would sink. Men would die. But the future had already been decided that morning in December. The carriers had lived. And because they had lived, the Navy had been given a second chance, not to fight the last war better, but to fight the next one at all. The ocean looked empty that morning. Too empty. Lieutenant Harold Finch stood in the ready room staring at a map that showed nothing but blue, broken only by faint grease pencil circles marking estimated enemy positions. Somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, Japanese carriers were moving as well, their decks crowded with aircraft, their commanders making the same guesses, drawing the same uncertain lines. Two fleets were closing in on each other, yet neither could see the other. Felt unnatural, like fighting a duel blindfolded. Finch had trained for surface engagements, for spotting masts on the horizon and measuring distance by eye. This was different. The enemy existed only as radio intercepts, reconnaissance reports, and probability. Every decision rested on information that might already be outdated by the time it was received. The ocean was vast enough to swallow certainty whole. When the order came to launch, there was no dramatic sight of enemy ships ahead. Only the relentless routine of flight operations. Engines roared. Deck crews moved with practiced urgency. Finch climbed into his aircraft knowing that he would not be aiming at something he could see, but at coordinates and faith. The target was an idea, not a silhouette. Hours later, somewhere over the Coral Sea, that idea became terrifyingly real. The sky filled with motion, aircraft weaving, diving, climbing, each pilot acting on fragments of information shouted over the radio. Finch never saw the carrier he attacked. He saw smoke, flashes, anti-aircraft fire clawing upward from an unseen deck below the clouds. Bombs fell through empty air until they didn't. Somewhere beneath him, steel burned. By the time he turned back toward his carrier, he realized what had happened. Two fleets had fought an entire battle without exchanging a single shell. No line of battle. No thunder of guns. The decisive blows had been struck by aircraft alone, launched from ships hidden far beyond the horizon. Back aboard his carrier, the mood was uneasy. There was no sense of triumph, only grim recognition. Losses were counted slowly. A carrier had been hit. Another was damaged. Men were missing. The battle had no clear victor, yet the meaning of it was impossible to ignore. The enemy's advance had been stopped, not by battleships, but by air power projected across hundreds of miles of open ocean. That night, Finch lay awake listening to the hum of machinery beneath his bunk. He understood that something fundamental had shifted. If fleets no longer needed to see each other to fight, then distance no longer offered safety. The sea itself had changed. Control would belong not to the heaviest ships, but to whoever could find the enemy first and strike from beyond reach. The rules of war had rewritten themselves somewhere over the Coral Sea, and there was no going back. The message arrived in pieces like a puzzle assembled under pressure. Commander Paul Harrington stood in the dim light of the operations room, listening as intelligence officers spoke in careful, measured tones. They did not say everything aloud. They didn't have to. The meaning was clear enough. Japanese plans had been uncovered, not fully, not perfectly, but enough. An attack was coming. Midway. Soon. Harrington felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. This was something else. Opportunity. For months, the war had felt reactive. Every move seemed like a response to Japanese initiative. Now, for the first time, the United States Navy knew where the enemy would be and when. The carriers would not rush blindly forward. They would wait. They would hide. And then they would strike. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the ocean was calm in a way that felt almost mocking. A light breeze rippled the surface as the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered but still operational Yorktown held their positions northeast of Midway. Somewhere to the west, for Japanese carriers were launching aircraft of their own, confident they were hunting an already defeated opponent. Harrington watched the flight deck come alive as the launch order was given. Pilots climbed into their aircraft knowing the odds were brutal. Fuel was tight. Navigation uncertain. Coordination imperfect. Some squadrons would never find the enemy at all. Others would arrive piecemeal, unprotected, and be torn apart. There was no turning back. The first reports were discouraging. Torpedo squadrons attacked alone, flying low and slow into walls of fire. Harrington listened as voices crackled over the radio. Calm, professional, and then suddenly gone. Planes vanished. Men died. Felt, for a moment, as if the gamble had failed. Then, everything changed. High above the chaos, dive bombers arrived almost by accident, drawn by smoke and instinct rather than plan. Harrington would later struggle to explain how such a decisive moment could emerge from such disorder. But in those few minutes, fate, chance, and preparation aligned. Bombs fell. One carrier erupted in flame. Then another. Fires raced across flight decks crowded with fueled aircraft and armed munitions. Explosions chained together, tearing ships open from the inside. The sky filled with smoke so thick it blotted out the sun. In the span of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded. Harrington stood frozen as confirmation after confirmation came in. This wasn't damage. This was annihilation. Years of training, experience, and confidence were burning on the ocean's surface. Japan's elite naval aviation, its sharpest edge, had been shattered in a single morning. The 4th carrier struck back later that day, landing a devastating blow of its own. Yorktown was hit, repaired, hit again. Men fought fires with the same desperate discipline seen at Pearl Harbor months earlier. This time, though, the outcome was different. The ship would eventually sink, but not before the damage had been contained long enough to keep the battle alive. By sunset, the truth was unavoidable. Japan had lost 4 frontline carriers. Thousands of sailors and aviators were gone. The United States had lost 1 carrier and many brave men, but it still had the ability to fight on. More importantly, the balance had shifted. Harrington walked the deck that evening as the sky darkened, stepping around exhausted crewmen and spent shell casings. No one cheered. There was no celebration. They all understood the scale of what had happened and what it would demand next. Midway had not won the war, but it had taken something from Japan that could never be replaced. Time, experience, momentum. The Pacific War would grind on for years, across jungles and reefs and open sea. But the moment it truly turned had lasted less than an hour. A handful of dive bombers, a brief opening, for carriers set ablaze. History would later describe it as decisive. Harrington knew it had been fragile, Had one report arrived later? Had one squadron missed its mark? Had one decision gone the other way? But none of that mattered now. The balance of the Pacific had shifted from the sky, and it would never shift back. Victory tasted different in the months after Midway. It was thinner, sharper. Lieutenant Jack Morales learned that on his first night off Guadalcanal, standing on the deck of a destroyer as the jungle vanished into darkness and the sea ahead dissolved into black. There was no horizon at night in the Solomon Islands. No comforting line where water met sky. Just darkness, heavy and absolute, broken only by the faint glow of instrument panels and the occasional flash of lightning far inland. Somewhere out there, Japanese ships were moving silent, fast and deadly. Morales had been told that Midway had turned the war. What he was seeing now suggested the enemy hadn't gotten the message. The radar screen flickered uncertainly. Contacts appeared, vanished, reappeared somewhere else. The technology was new, untrusted, and poorly understood. Some officers believed it implicitly. Others ignored it altogether, relying instead on binoculars and instinct. Morales watched the bridge crew argue in hushed, urgent tones while minutes slipped away. Then the night exploded. Searchlights snapped on without warning, stabbing across the water. Shellfire followed instantly, orange flashes ripping through the darkness as heavy guns spoke at point-blank range. The noise was overwhelming. Metal screaming, guns hammering, orders shouted into the void. Morales felt the deck shudder beneath his boots as the destroyer accelerated hard, weaving to avoid incoming fire. There was no elegance here, no clean formations. Ships blundered into each other's paths, firing at muzzle flash and sound. Japanese cruisers struck with terrifying precision, their long-range torpedoes tearing into Allied ships before many crews even knew they were under attack. Morales saw a cruiser ahead take multiple hits in seconds, flames racing up her superstructure as men leapt into the water. The destroyer he served on was smaller, faster, and far more fragile. Its job was to get close, to close the distance that battleships once ruled, but now belonged to torpedoes and nerves. Morales felt the ship lurch as torpedoes were fired, white wakes slicing through black water toward unseen targets. Seconds stretched unbearably. Then a distant explosion rolled across the sea. The battle ended as suddenly as it began, leaving wreckage, burning oil, and silence behind. Morales leaned against the rail, hands shaking, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't the clean, decisive war he'd imagined after Midway. This was chaos, brutal, personal, and unforgiving. Guadalcanal was like that, every day a lesson paid for in blood. The Navy learned quickly or it died. Radar operators were retrained under fire. Commanders learned to trust instruments over instincts honed for a different era. Destroyer crews perfected night fighting, coordinating attacks with a precision born of desperation. Tactics evolved not in classrooms, but in the narrow margins between survival and annihilation. Morales watched the change happen ship by ship, crew by crew. Early defeats hardened into grim competence. Mistakes became less frequent, though never harmless. The enemy was still lethal, still aggressive, and still willing to fight at knife range in the dark. By the time Morales left the Solomons, he understood the truth no victory parade would ever show. Midway had given the Navy a chance. Guadalcanal decided whether it deserved to keep it. Survival was no longer assumed. It was earned night after night, mile by mile, in waters that remembered every mistake. The war was no longer about winning quickly. It was about learning faster than the enemy and staying alive long enough for those lessons to matter. The explosion threw Lieutenant Commander Robert Ellis against the bulkhead hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. The lights went out instantly. Somewhere deep inside the ship, metal screamed as if the hull itself were alive and in pain. For a moment, there was only darkness, heat, and the taste of smoke. Ellis didn't wait for orders. He didn't have to. He was already moving before his feet found the deck again. "Fire parties, forward!" someone shouted, the words barely cutting through the roar of flames and ruptured steam lines. The ship had taken a bomb hit, direct, brutal, the kind that should have crippled it. Ellis had seen what similar hits did to enemy ships. He had watched Japanese vessels burn uncontrollably, flames racing unchecked until the sea claimed them. This ship didn't burn that way. Watertight doors slammed shut in sequence, sealing compartments with mechanical precision. Damage control teams poured into the smoke, hauling hoses, dragging wounded men clear, bracing bulkheads that were already flooding. There was no panic, only urgency. Every sailor knew his role. Every second mattered. Ellis knelt beside a young seaman struggling to tighten a valve with blistered hands. They worked together in silence until the flow of water slowed, then stopped. Somewhere above them, another team was fighting a fire that should have spread, but hadn't. The ship was wounded, but it was still fighting. This wasn't luck. It was designed. American warships were built to survive punishment. Compartments were isolated, systems duplicated, fires assumed rather than feared. Crews drilled endlessly for moments like this, blind, choking, terrifying moments when discipline mattered more than courage. Damage control wasn't a specialty. It was a culture. Ellis had trained for this before the war, long before anyone knew what Guadalcanal or Midway would demand. Back then, the drills felt excessive. Now they felt like the only reason he was still alive. The difference became clearer with every battle. Ships on both sides were hit by bombs and torpedoes of similar size and power, but outcomes diverged sharply. Where American ships often staggered, burned, and survived, enemy ships frequently vanished beneath the waves. The reason wasn't a mystery. It was philosophy. Japanese naval design prized speed and offensive power. Armor was sacrificed. Compartmentalization was limited. Fire suppression was secondary to striking first. When those ships were hit, fire spread unchecked, ammunition cooked off, and damage cascaded beyond control. American ships absorbed blows instead of amplifying them. Ellis felt the deck settle as flooding was brought under control. The ship listed, but it held. Engines restarted. Power returned in flickering bursts. Within hours, the carrier was launching aircraft again, scars still smoldering along her hull. That was the real advantage, one that never appeared in tonnage charts or victory headlines. Survivability turned damage into delay instead of defeat, kept pilots flying, fleets intact, and momentum alive. Ellis stood on deck at dusk, watching smoke drift away into the open sea. The ship looked battered, ugly even, but it was afloat, still lethal, still moving forward. Two ships could take the same hit. One would disappear beneath the waves. The other would fight on. And in a war decided by endurance as much as firepower, that difference changed everything. By 1944, the war no longer felt like a series of battles. Captain Edward Lawson sensed it standing on the bridge as his carrier group refueled in the open Pacific, hundreds of miles from the nearest port. Oilers slid alongside with practiced ease. Hoses connected. Fuel transferred while engines remained warm and ready. Aircraft were repaired on deck. Damaged planes were replaced almost casually, rolled up from hangars that seemed bottomless. Nothing about it felt heroic. That was the point. Lawson had stopped thinking of the Navy as a collection of ships or men. It was a system now, vast, impersonal, relentless. Pilots arrived already trained, already hardened by instructors who had survived earlier battles and passed their knowledge forward. Losses were replaced not with desperation, but with preparation. Where Japan struggled to field inexperienced aviators with minimal hours, the Americans rotated veterans home to train the next wave. Skill was no longer rare. It was manufactured. The enemy still fought fiercely. Individual Japanese pilots still flew with courage and precision. But Lawson could feel the imbalance growing with each operation. Every American strike was backed by logistics that seemed to stretch forever. Fuel, spare parts, fresh crews, floating dry docks that could rebuild a damaged ship without returning home. The war had shifted from moments of brilliance to something colder and more decisive. Heroics mattered less than throughput. Endurance mattered more than daring. Somewhere along the way, inevitability crept in. Not certainty, war was never that kind, but momentum that could not be reversed by a single victory. Japan was fighting ships. The United States was fighting time, production, and learning curves, and it was winning all three. While the carriers dominated the sky, another war unfolded far below the surface, unseen by most and remembered by few. Lieutenant Commander Frank Holloway lived that war inside a steel tube, surrounded by darkness and pressure. His submarine prowled shipping lanes in silence, hunting merchant vessels that carried the lifeblood of the Japanese Empire. There were no dogfights here, no formations, just long stretches of waiting, broken by minutes of terror. Depth charges turned the ocean into a hammer. Each explosion rattled the hull, lights flickering, bolts groaning as if they might shear free. Holloway listened to the sounds of water rushing where it shouldn't, of men breathing too loudly in confined spaces. One mistake, one sound too many, and there would be no escape. The results were devastating. One ship after another disappeared beneath the waves. Cargo lost, fuel gone, supplies never delivered. Japan's war economy began to suffocate slowly, invisibly, relentlessly. The cost was high. 1 in 5 submariners never returned. Entire crews vanished without witnesses, without graves. At the same time, far across the world, the Atlantic told a parallel story. Early on, American shipping had burned within sight of its own shores. U-boats hunted almost unopposed. It was a humiliation born of unpreparedness. But here too the system adapted. Convoys formed. Escort carriers joined the fight. Radar, patrol aircraft, and hunter-killer groups turned the tide. The ocean that had once favored the hunter became a trap. Holloway returned from patrol thinner, quieter, older. He had done his part in a war few would ever see. The headlines belonged to carriers and invasions, but he knew the truth. The enemy had been beaten just as surely in darkness and silence. No victory came without friction. The Navy argued with the Army. Commanders clashed over strategy. Faulty torpedoes cost lives early in the war. Some decisions invited unnecessary risk. Some leaders pushed too far. And the price was always paid to men. By the end, more than 36,000 sailors were dead. Ships that had become legends lay at the bottom of the sea. The cost was real, permanent, and impossible to smooth over with numbers alone. And yet, the fleet kept growing. By 1945, it spanned every ocean. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, a naval force so large, so practiced, and so interconnected that no single blow could break it. Failure no longer meant collapse. It meant adjustment. That was the final lesson of the war. The United States Navy did not win because it avoided mistakes. It won because it could survive them, because it could absorb loss, learn, and continue forward with greater force than before. It did not just defeat its enemies, it outlasted them. By the time the guns fell silent, naval warfare itself had been transformed. What began in chaos and fire ended in dominance forged through systems, endurance, and hard-earned adaptation. The war was over. The ocean would never be the same.